In the shadowed heart of 14th century Italy, where faith was both shield and shackle, a young woman named Lucia of Monferrato became an unlikely spark in the rigid world of piety. Born into a noble family in the rolling hills of Monferrato, Lucia was not destined for the battlefield or the marriage bed, as her brothers and sisters were. Instead, her fate was sealed by a father whose coffers ran dry. In an age when dowries dictated a daughter's worth, Lucia, the third daughter, was an expense too many. The solution was as old as the church itself, the convent. At 17, she was sent to the convent of St. Margaret, a cold stone fortress where devotion was demanded and individuality was a sin. Picture it, a young woman, sharp-tongued and quick-witted, stepping into a world designed to break her spirit. Her family saw it as salvation. Lucia saw it as a sentence. The journey to St. Margaret's was no pilgrimage of faith. Historical accounts suggest noble families like Lucia's often used convents as a socially acceptable way to offload daughters who strained their finances or defied their plans. In 14th century Italy, the church was not just a spiritual institution, but a social safety net, absorbing surplus daughters into its cloisters. For Lucia, this meant leaving behind the vibrant feasts and lively courts of Monferrato for a life of enforced silence and prayer. The convent's walls, thick and gray, stood as a reminder of her new reality, a place where joy was suspect and obedience was divine currency. Yet Lucia, with her piercing intelligence and irreverent humor, was no ordinary novice. She arrived with a mind too restless for the crucifix and a tongue too sharp for silence. Her first day set the tone. During the abbess's lengthy sermon on humility, Lucia, barely containing her boredom, asked if a shorter version was available. The room froze. Nuns accustomed to whispers and downcast eyes stared in disbelief. The abbess, a woman whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the convent, marked her as trouble. By day 2, Lucia cemented her reputation, dozing off during morning prayers, standing up no less. When confronted, she quipped, "If God wanted me awake at this hour, he'd have made dawn later." The punishment was swift. Hours of scrubbing floors, a task meant to teach humility, but which Lucia turned into a stage for muttering creative insults under her breath. Her defiance wasn't just rebellion, it was a refusal to let the convent's monotony dull her spirit. Life inside St. Margaret's was a grueling test of endurance. The day began at 4 a.m., with bells that could wake the dead, summoning nuns to prayer in a chapel so cold it seemed to mock the idea of divine warmth. Meals were meager, boiled roots, stale bread, and fish that tasted of regret. Talking was forbidden outside confession, a rule that turned silence into a kind of torture. The nuns, draped in coarse habits, moved like ghosts through their tasks, weaving, praying, fasting, and repenting. For most, this was a life of surrender, a slow erasure of self in service to God. But Lucia saw it differently. To her, the convent was a prison of collective misery, its rules a challenge to her ingenuity. She studied her fellow sisters, noting who craved extra bread, who resented the abbess, and who could be bribed with a smuggled drop of honey. Within weeks, she knew more about the convent's undercurrents than the bishop himself. Her letters home, though none survived, likely burned by a furious abbess, were said to lament the lack of decent wine, humor, and humanity. These writings, pieced together from second-hand accounts in monastic records, reveal a woman painfully aware of her entrapment. In one rumored letter, she described the convent as a tomb for the living, where even God seems bored. Such boldness was dangerous. The 14th century church prized conformity, especially from women, who were expected to embody meekness. Lucia's refusal to comply was not just personal, it was a quiet rebellion against a system that saw her as a problem to be solved. Noble daughters like her were often sent to convents not for piety, but for practicality, a custom rooted in economic necessity. The dowry system meant that marrying off multiple daughters could bankrupt a family. So the church became a convenient depository, cloaking financial pragmatism in spiritual virtue. Yet Lucia's defiance wasn't born of malice, but of a fierce individuality that clashed with the convent's rigid structure. She didn't reject faith outright. She rejected the idea that faith required misery. Her sarcasm, her wit, her refusal to bow to the abbess's dour authority, these were her weapons in a world that demanded she be invisible. As she navigated the convent's cold halls, she began to see opportunity where others saw only despair. The rules were clear: pray, fast, and pretend to like it. But Lucia, with her knack for finding loopholes, was already planning her first act of rebellion, one that would make her not just a nuisance, but a legend in the making. As the weeks turned into months at St. Margaret's, Lucia's initial sparks of defiance grew into a steady flame, challenging the convent's unyielding grip on its inhabitants. She wasn't content with mere survival. She sought to inject life into the lifeless routine, starting with the small rebellions that would soon escalate into legendary acts of mischief. While the other nuns devoted their days to weaving tapestries of repentance and whispering prayers like echoes in an empty hall, Lucia turned her keen observations into action. She identified the sisters' hidden cravings, the stolen glances at the kitchen, the suppressed sighs during endless sermons, and began weaving a web of subtle alliances. It was in this environment of monastic discipline, where rules were etched into every stone and enforced with the rigor of a military camp, that Lucia's cleverness shone brightest. The convent's cellar, a dim vault holding sacramental wine meant solely for communion, became the stage for her first major transgression. In medieval times, wine was not just a beverage, but a symbol of divine blood, its use strictly regulated to prevent the very temptations Lucia embraced. One moonlit night, while the abbess and most sisters were lost in prayers for humility, Lucia enlisted two like-minded novices, restless souls weary of the convent's joyless existence. Armed with flickering candles and empty mugs, they descended into the cool darkness, rationalizing their raid as a harmless quality control check. What started as cautious sips evolved into the convent's first unofficial feast, dubbed the Feast of St. Hover, by Lucia's wry humor. Laughter, long banished from these walls, bubbled up uncontrollably, echoing softly through the stone corridors. The morning after brought a reckoning. Prayers that day carried the faint tang of fermented grapes, and the abbess, her nose twitching like a hound on the scent, declared it a harbinger of demonic influence. Lucia, ever the quick thinker, responded with feigned innocence. Perhaps it was the Holy Spirit moving through us. Her quip, technically aligned with scripture yet laced with irreverence, only fueled the abbess's fury. This incident wasn't isolated. It tapped into a deeper cultural undercurrent of medieval monastic life, where humor was often seen as a threat to spiritual focus. Chronicles from the era reveal that convents enforced silence to foster closeness to God, but in practice, it bred isolation and madness. Lucia's act pierced that veil, introducing laughter as a revolutionary force. Contraband joy in a realm where even smiles were rationed. Punishments followed, each more inventive than the last, designed to break her spirit but only sharpening her resolve. The abbess ordered Lucia to copy scriptures for a full month, a tedious task meant to instill reverence through repetition. Instead, Lucia adorned the margins with doodles of drowsy saints and biting commentary, such as, "And lo, the Lord said, try harder next time." When discovered, she claimed it was divine inspiration, a defense that blended theology with sarcasm, leaving the abbess sputtering. In the confessional, a space sacred for unburdening sins but often the only outlet for speech, Lucia turned weekly visits into performances. Priests, expecting rote recitations of minor faults, were met with her deadpan, "Not yet, but I have plans." Confession in medieval convent culture served as both spiritual cleansing and rare social interaction. Some sisters attended twice daily just to hear a human voice. Lucia exploited this, using it to annoy, amuse, and subtly recruit allies among the younger nuns. Word of her antics spread like wildfire through dry grass. The younger sisters, starved for levity and a life of relentless austerity, began sneaking extra bread under her influence, swapping jests during psalms, and questioning the divine mandate for perpetual misery. Laughter, once borderline heresy, became contagious, transforming whispered complaints into shared giggles. The abbess, blaming Satan for the shift in atmosphere, intensified her vigilance, but Lucia had already sown the seeds of change. This phase of her rebellion highlighted the tension in medieval religious orders between enforced discipline and human nature's need for expression. Historical records from similar convents show that such acts of defiance, though rare, often stemmed from the psychological strain of isolation, where humor became a lifeline against despair. As the convent buzzed with this newfound undercurrent of mirth, Lucia's influence grew, drawing wary admiration from some and outright fear from others. The once unquestioned authority of the abbess began to crack, and rumors escaped the walls, reaching the ears of local priests and merchants. What began as a personal stand against boredom was evolving into something far riskier, a challenge to the very foundations of monastic life. Lucia had tasted freedom in forbidden sips and shared laughs, and she was far from done. In the cloistered world of St. Margaret's, where the church's grip on morality was ironclad, nothing terrified the hierarchy more than a nun wielding charisma like a weapon. Sister Lucia of Monferrato possessed it in abundance, turning her into a walking scandal, a public menace wrapped in a habit. It started subtly, or as subtly as a woman forbidden from even smiling could manage. A visiting priest, drawn to the convent for routine confessions, praised her eloquent reading of the Psalms during a communal service. Lucia, buoyed by a mix of lingering wine haze from her secret feasts and a lifetime of stifled boredom, responded with disarming confidence, "Father, I've had plenty of practice speaking to men who don't listen." The gasp from the assembled sisters was so collective, it mimicked a second choir, rippling through the chapel like a forbidden breeze. From that moment, the floodgates of flirtation creaked open, defying the medieval church's strict views on gender roles, which confined women, especially nuns, to realms of silence and submission. In an era when heresy was often equated with any challenge to patriarchal authority, Lucia's boldness bordered on the blasphemous, yet it captivated those around her. Priests returned for confessions but left spiritually disoriented, their purity of thought disrupted by her wit. One chronicler later described her as a distraction to the sanctity of the soul, while another confided in whispers that interacting with her felt like auditioning for damnation. Her advances weren't overt. They were laced with intellectual play, complimenting a monk's divinely sculpted hands during donation negotiations, or turning discussions of relics into exchanges that demanded absolution afterward. This charisma wasn't mere flirtation. It was a subversion of the church's doctrine that viewed women as vessels of temptation, echoing historical tensions seen in figures like Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary authority challenged male-dominated theology. The abbess, sensing the shift in the air like a storm brewing, attempted to intervene, confining Lucia to menial tasks away from visitors. But Lucia bowed with theatrical flair and quipped, "Forgive me, Mother. I was merely spreading the warmth of Christ's love." The response was more fasting, a punishment meant to humble, but which Lucia reframed as inspiration for midnight feasts. Rumors soon seeped beyond the convent's drafty walls, drifting through the village like incense from a cracked censer. Whispers spoke of nuns too joyful, men visiting too frequently, and a chapel faintly scented with wine and forbidden perfume. In 14th century Italy, where the church was intensifying its crackdown on heresy amid rising inquisitorial fervor, such tales equated laughter and allure with sin, blurring the lines between spiritual ecstasy and earthly desire. Lucia's theological twists only amplified the scandal. She penned a hymn to heavenly desires that read suspiciously like a love poem, defending it as an exploration of the soul's intimacy with God, a clever bend of scripture that drew on mystical traditions like those of Saint Teresa of Avila, though centuries early. The abbess muttered of blasphemy in rhyme, but Lucia's calm explanations left interrogators questioning their own faith. By now she wasn't merely breaking rules. She was reshaping theology to suit her spirit, enjoying the chaos it wrought. The convent, once a bastion of restraint, hummed with gossip and stifled giggles, its reputation teetering on the edge of ruin. Heaven itself seemed to have a rival, emerging not from distant heresies, but from within the cloister's sacred confines, where one nun's charisma threatened to unravel the threads of divine order. If medieval sin had a sound, It would have been the unrestrained laughter echoing from the convent of St. Margaret long after midnight, a melody that defied the solemn hush of prayer. And if it had a face, it would have been Sister Lucia of Monferrato, her features illuminated by flickering candlelight, grinning with the sly satisfaction of someone who had just outwitted the 10 Commandments themselves. What began as innocent whispers among the bored nuns, late-night confessions of lives before vows, reminiscing about the silk dresses that whispered against skin, the lively music of feasts, and the charm of men who spoke in tongues far from Latin, quickly escalated under Lucia's masterful orchestration. Her talent for turning the mundane into the magnificent was unmatched. She saw potential in every shadow, every suppressed sigh. One fateful night, Lucia borrowed the abbess's keys, a daring act that echoed tales from other medieval convent scandals, like those whispered in Boccaccio's Decameron, where nuns defied their seclusion in pursuit of earthly delights. With the cellar door creaking open like a forbidden invitation, she declared to her growing circle of conspirators that joy, too, was a form of prayer, a divine gift not to be squandered in eternal gloom. Soon, the convent's vigils transformed into after-hours theology debates, fueled by pastries smuggled in by sympathetic local servants and, on bolder evenings, the tunes of a wandering minstrel brave enough to serenade a house full of holy women through a cracked window. Reports from the era, preserved in ecclesiastical letters, paint scenes that resemble less a sacred enclosure and more a medieval sleepover spiraling into delightful anarchy. Music swelling through the halls, nuns dancing in circles with habits swirling like forgotten veils, and bread rolls lobbed in rhythmic games that dissolved into peals of laughter. Lucia called these gatherings celebrations of divine creation, quoting scripture with a looseness that would make theologians twitch, passages from Psalms twisted to justify movement as praise, feasting as fellowship. Her confidence disarmed even the most hesitant. She sinned with the precision of a professional and defended it with the eloquence of a lawyer, blending charisma and cunning in a way that made resistance futile. To heighten the spectacle, she once adorned the statue of the Virgin Mary with ribbons and a dash of pilfered perfume, insisting it was to make the Blessed Mother feel included in their joy. A nervous novice, convinced by Lucia's persuasive theology that dancing was a sacred act of exuberance, joined in with tentative steps that soon turned triumphant. This wasn't mere mischief. It was a profound commentary on the repression of emotions in religious orders, where the Church's emphasis on asceticism often stifled the very humanity it sought to redeem. Historical parallels abound, such as the 13th century scandals at the Abbey of Port Royal in France, where nuns' emotional expressions were deemed heretical, leading to inquisitions that exposed the fragile line between devotion and desire. What made matters worse, or infinitely more thrilling, depending on one's perspective, was Lucia's innate sense of showmanship. She staged these events with the flair of a court jester elevated to director, ensuring every participant felt the thrill of liberation. But sound travels, especially in the still nights of rural Italy, and the noise carried beyond the convent's imposing walls. Villagers, accustomed to the solemn quiet of St. Margaret's, swore they heard real laughter, not the restrained, saintly chuckles permitted in scripture readings, but full-throated joy that pierced the darkness. Rumors ignited like dry tinder. The sisters were possessed, bewitched by some unholy force. One merchant, peering through the gates under moonlight, claimed to see silhouettes of dancing nuns in candlelight, their forms moving as if chased by invisible demons. He wasn't entirely wrong. The demons were boredom and repression, unleashed by Lucia's unyielding spirit. As whispers evolved into outright scandal, the abbess, her authority crumbling like stale communion wafers, penned desperate letters to the bishop begging for intervention. By the time the bishop's messenger arrived for an initial probe, Lucia had preemptively orchestrated a penitential feast, a clever ruse complete with candles arranged in devotional patterns, harmonious singing of altered hymns and chalices brimming with suspiciously red wine. When pressed to explain the disturbances, she replied with serene conviction, "Rejoice, for the Lord said to make a joyful noise unto him." The messenger departed with a head full of doubts, and a heart unsettled. His report a mix of bewilderment and reluctant admiration. The abbess, in a final bid to restore order, banned all evening gatherings, decreeing that after sunset, silence must reign supreme. Lucia nodded with obedient grace, her eyes twinkling with unspoken mischief, and promptly rescheduled the next revelry for the break of dawn. The convent's reputation was collapsing faster than its dwindling wine supply, tarnished by tales that spread through markets and taverns. In this transformation, Sister Lucia had unwittingly founded the medieval equivalent of nightlife, a clandestine world where repressed emotions found release, challenging the Church's doctrine that suffering was the path to salvation. Social historians note that such outbreaks in religious orders often stemmed from the psychological toll of enforced celibacy and isolation, where human needs for connection and joy clashed with institutional demands for austerity. Lucia's gatherings weren't just parties. They were acts of emotional defiance, echoes of broader societal tensions in an era when the Church's control over personal expression was absolute, yet increasingly contested. As the bishop pondered his next move, the convent teetered on the brink, its once silent halls alive with the dangerous hum of possibility. It started with whispers, the kind that make even the stone walls of a convent lean in closer, as if the very architecture sensed the brewing storm. At first, no one showed obvious signs, but subtle changes, a fuller habit here, a lingering pallor there, were dismissed as the toll of poor diet, unrelenting stress, or perhaps some divine intervention gone awry. But when the second sister began mysteriously gaining weight, the fragile veil of silence shattered into outright scandal. Pregnancy within a convent was akin to spotting smoke in a fireworks factory. Everyone knew an explosion was imminent, yet no one dared speak first. The abbess fainted dramatically, collapsing like a marionette with cut strings. The confessor turned as pale as the altar linens he clutched. And Sister Lucia of Monferrato? She simply crossed her arms, surveyed the chaos she had undoubtedly inspired, and delivered her line with impeccable timing. Well, miracles do happen. The investigations erupted immediately. For the medieval Church thrived on scandals it could feign shock over while wielding them as tools for control. Priests were hauled in for questioning, servants interrogated under the guise of routine inquiries, and midwives summoned discreetly, their expertise cloaked in medical curiosity. This process mirrored the era's ecclesiastical inquiries, often conducted with a mix of fervor and formality, drawing from inquisitorial methods that had roots in earlier heresy hunts like those against the Cathars. The abbess, her voice trembling with righteous indignation, swore the devil had infiltrated the convent's sacred bounds. Lucia privately concurred, though she omitted the detail that this particular devil might have sauntered through the front gate, disguised in a cassock and bearing compliments. The official report, scrawled in a scribe's trembling Latin and preserved in dusty diocesan archives, chronicled the discovery of carnal corruption within the house of God. In plain terms, several nuns were with child, and details were scarce as confessions. When one young sister, cornered by relentless probing, burst into tears, she stammered, "Sister Lucia told us joy was holy." That admission, laden with unintended accusation, sealed fates. Lucia, of course, denied everything with the poise of someone who'd rehearsed in front of a mirror, or perhaps the reflective surface of a chalice. She attributed the lapses to fleeting temptations, the seductive pull of moonlight, the weakening effects of diluted wine, and the devil's cunning whispers. When pressed on whether she had encouraged the others, her response was a masterstroke of ambiguity. Only in faith, and perhaps in bad decisions. The abbess demanded heartfelt repentance. Lucia offered charm in its stead, confessing vaguely while quoting the sensual verses of the Song of Solomon, smiling through every barbed accusation. The priests emerged from her interrogation dazed, as if they'd been spiritually ambushed, their convictions shaken by her unyielding wit. By this point, the convent's reputation had plummeted entirely, transforming from a beacon of piety into a whispered jest. Locals murmured that St. Margaret's had devolved into a house of unholy maternity, where vows bent like reeds in the wind. Merchants chuckled in taverns that procuring wine from the sisters was simpler than eliciting a prayer. One contemporary chronicler, his words etched with a mix of horror and fascination, noted that within those walls, vows are as weak as watered mead. The secrecy had evaporated. What was once hushed rumor had become a public spectacle, rippling through society and underscoring the fragility of religious institutions in an age when scandals could topple reputations overnight. The societal impact was profound. Such events fueled broader distrust in monastic orders, contributing to calls for reform that echoed through the centuries, prefiguring the upheavals of the Reformation. The bishop could no longer feign ignorance. Rome itself was taking notes, and the abbess teetered on the edge of spontaneous combustion from sheer exasperation. Lucia, ever the calm in the storm, merely shrugged and observed, "If sin spreads this quickly, perhaps joy is contagious." And in that moment, she captured a truth that resonated beyond the cloister. Human desires, once unleashed, defied containment. When Bishop Aldo Brandini finally descended upon St. Margaret's, it was no cordial visit or uplifting sermon. It was a full-throated spiritual intervention, the medieval counterpart to a corporate overlord storming a wayward branch office after one too many infractions. A man of grave demeanor, with a voice that boomed like thunder in a cathedral, an imposing mitre that seemed to add inches to his stature, and a moral rigidity as unyielding as marble. He arrived forewarned of spiritual compromise. He envisioned minor lapses, prideful whispers, idle gossip, perhaps haphazard hymnody. What greeted him was a tableau of utter disarray. Arriving at dawn, expecting to find the sisters bowed in early prayer, he instead encountered Lucia leading what could only be termed a brunch laced with liturgy. Pastries dotted the tables, laughter mingled with half-sung hymns, and wine masqueraded in chalices. One nun strummed a lute with abandon. Another dozed mid-bite, her cheek pillowed on a roll. The bishop nearly let his staff clatter to the floor in shock. Lucia greeted him with warm poise, curtsying deeply and intoning, "Your Grace, how kind of you to join us. The Lord bids us welcome all guests." She extended a piece of bread, an offering that blurred the line between hospitality and provocation. The inspection spiraled downward from there. The chapel reeked faintly of perfume intertwined with guilt, a sensory assault on his senses. The confession booth yielded 2 empty bottles and a solitary shoe, relics of revelry. In a locked chamber, he uncovered fine fabrics, stacks of love letters, and an object that might have been a lute or, depending on one's view of music, a tool of temptation. Demanding explanations, he watched the abbess dissolve into tears, wailing that control had slipped from her grasp. Lucia stepped forward serenely. "Control is an illusion. Your Grace, only faith endures." He jotted it down reflexively before grasping the mockery. He launched into a sermon on repentance. But midway, a sneeze interrupted, prompting Lucia's cheerful, "Bless you." The room erupted in laughter, and the bishop simmered on the verge of eruption. By sunset, he proclaimed the convent riddled with worldly corruption and mandated a thorough investigation. Departing, he branded Lucia a disgrace to her vows. Her sweet smile returned. "At least I didn't bore anyone into sin." That night, with the last dregs of wine, Lucia toasted her looming fate among the sisters. "The bishop craves a confession. Tomorrow I'll deliver a performance." Even before the formal probe commenced, she had recast it as theater, her unquenchable spirit turning crisis into captivating drama. Bishop Aldo Brandini's departure from St. Margaret's didn't just leave behind a whirlwind of outrage and hastily scribbled decrees. It unleashed a torrent of paperwork that would make even the most diligent scribe weep. Within a week, the official ecclesiastical investigation commenced, a spectacle of medieval bureaucracy at its most self-important, complete with scribes scratching away on parchment, witnesses shuffling nervously, and an air of solemnity that bordered on the absurd. 3 men were dispatched to restore the tarnished sheen of holiness to the convent. Father Gregor, a meticulous note-taker whose quill never ceased its dance. Brother Paolo, a frail soul who flinched at the slightest ray of sunlight as if it were divine judgment, and a stern Dominican inquisitor whose gaze could curdle milk, looking every bit the man who'd prefer to be igniting heretics rather than questioning wayward nuns. They established their tribunal in the chapel, beneath a fresco depicting the Last Judgment, a fitting backdrop for the drama about to unfold, where souls hung in the balance amid vivid depictions of salvation and damnation. The interrogations began with the quieter sisters, those whose spirits had long been subdued by the convent's relentless regimen. Most dissolved into tears under the weight of scrutiny, some confessing minor infractions with the fervor of the truly penitent, while a few fainted for added theatrical flair, their collapses echoing through the stone chamber. When queried about Sister Lucia of Monferrato, responses varied wildly, from tentative praises of her kindness to vehement declarations that she was the devil in a wimple. Father Gregor underlined that last accusation twice, his ink blotching the page in emphasis. This phase mirrored the procedural norms of medieval tribunals, often modeled after the inquisitorial methods formalized in the 13th century by Pope Gregory IX, where witnesses were examined in isolation to prevent collusion, and confessions were extracted through persistent questioning rather than outright torture, though the psychological pressure was no less intense. Evidence soon materialized, and it was nothing short of glorious in its incriminating detail, painting a picture of corruption that even the most skeptical inquisitor couldn't ignore. Tucked behind a statue of Saint Margaret herself, the investigators unearthed a hidden stash, barrels of wine that sloshed accusingly when disturbed, an ornate box brimming with pilfered jewelry that gleamed like forbidden stars, and a lute engraved with the tender inscription, "To my most divine muse." In a nearby drawer, they discovered a sheaf of letters penned in Romantic Latin, each signed with a cryptic initial. No one could pinpoint who SP might be, but Lucia's enigmatic smile during later questioning hinted at intimate knowledge. The confessional booth, that sacred enclave of absolution, yielded its own surprises. Beneath the bench lay scattered coins, a half-eaten apple still bearing teeth marks, and a poem that opened with "Blessed be the hands that touched the holy veil." Even the stoic inquisitor felt a flush creep up his neck, his composure cracking under the weight of such earthly verses. Lucia was summoned last, a deliberate tactic in medieval tribunal procedures to build suspense and allow prior testimonies to accumulate like storm clouds. She arrived with an air of unruffled composure, as if facing charges of mass corruption was merely another tedious Tuesday in her eventful life. Seated before the trio, her habit neatly arranged and her gaze steady, she met their accusations with a serenity that bordered on the supernatural. When presented with the incriminating letters, she examined them with mild curiosity, then offered, "Perhaps God writes to all women through the hands of men." The scribe paused mid-stroke, his quill hovering uncertainly, torn between labeling it heresy or profound poetry. This response delved into theological debates of the era, echoing the mystical interpretations of divine love found in works like Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs, where earthly affection was allegorized as spiritual union, though Lucia's twist carried a subversive edge that challenged the male-dominated hierarchy. Her calm demeanor infuriated the tribunal, transforming their inquiry into a battle of wills. She quoted scripture with fluid expertise, twisting theological tenets to her defense, and smiled through every pointed accusation as if they were compliments in disguise. When charged with misleading her sisters into sin, she replied with philosophical poise, "If joy is misleading, then sorrow must be salvation." That line, laden with irony, found its way into at least one bishop's private diary, a testament to its lingering impact. The inquisitor pressed on the wine barrels, demanding an explanation for such blatant misuse of sacramental goods. Lucia leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "The Lord turned water into wine at Cana to bring joy to a wedding. Who are we to deny his example in our own house of faith?" This invoked the Gospel of John, sparking an impromptu debate on the boundaries of miraculous precedent versus monastic restraint, common tension in medieval theology, where literal interpretations clashed with ascetic ideals. Brother Paolo, his sunlight aversion forgotten in the heat of the moment, challenged her on the pregnancies, linking them directly to her influence. Lucia's eyes softened with feigned sympathy. "Temptation finds us all, brother. Even saints wrestled with the flesh." Her defenses weren't denials so much as reframings, turning evidence into enigmas and sins into scholarly discussions. By week's end, the tribunal had amassed enough material to condemn an entire village. Letters, artifacts, tearful testimonies. But what they hadn't anticipated was Lucia's lack of fear. She wasn't cowed by punishment. She was weary of the charade, her boredom with the proceedings evident in every wry retort. In this, she embodied the narrative tension of historical inquisitions, where the accused's eloquence could sometimes sway outcomes, or at minimum, etch their words into the annals of defiance. As the men packed their parchments, they realized too late that Lucia wasn't merely defending herself. She was scripting her own legend, turning the tribunal into the prelude to her masterpiece of rebellion. Trials in medieval Europe were seldom about justice. They were spectacles, grand theaters where power flexed its muscles under the guise of divine will, and Sister Lucia of Monferrato was poised to deliver the performance of a lifetime, transforming accusation into art. The hall brimmed with anticipation, packed tighter than a pilgrim's satchel, priests in their somber cassocks, nobles draped in finery that whispered of influence, monks with hooded eyes, and even a pair of merchants who'd wandered in, drawn by the promise of drama like moths to a heresy bonfire. The air hung heavy with incense, the sharp tang of judgment, and the faint mustiness of wet parchment from the scribe's frantic preparations. Lucia stood at the center, clad in her plain black habit, yet somehow making it appear as a bold statement against the opulence around her, a visual defiance that set the tone for what was to come. The charges were intoned aloud by a clerk whose voice cracked under the weight of their severity. Disobedience to holy vows, blasphemy against the sacred order, seduction of the faithful, unlawful propagation of joy, misuse of sacramental wine, and the encouragement of unseemly laughter. That final indictment elicited an audible gasp from the audience, as if mirth itself were a capital offense, which, in the rigid framework of medieval justice, it might as well have been. Laughter disrupted the solemnity the church prized, challenging the authority that thrived on fear and repentance. This system, rooted in canon law formalized by Gratian's decretum in the 12th century, blended Roman legal traditions with ecclesiastical dogma, often prioritizing spectacle over fairness to reinforce hierarchical control. Trials like Lucia's served as public warnings, emotional hooks that tugged at the collective conscience, reminding all of the perils of defiance. Lucia listened with her head slightly tilted, her expression one of polite bemusement, as if the litany were a menu she'd neither ordered nor desired. When Bishop Aldo Brandini, presiding with the gravity of a man who'd rather be anywhere else, asked if she had words in her defense, she clasped her hands in mock piety and replied, "Your Grace, I merely followed the example of our Lord, surrounded by sinners, misunderstood by priests." The room fell into a stunned silence, the scribe's quill tumbling from his fingers in a clatter that echoed like thunder. Her words, a clever inversion of gospel narratives, struck at the heart of the proceedings, turning the accused into a mirror for her accusers and evoking the emotional rawness of Christ's own trials. It was a masterstroke, blending wit with theology to hook the audience's sympathy, even as it skirted blasphemy. The prosecutors, undeterred but visibly rattled, pressed forward with a flourish of evidence. The romantic letters waved like captured banners, receipts for pilfered wine brandished as proof of excess, and even the engraved lute presented as a symbol of worldly indulgence. Lucia examined each item with feigned interest, her fingers tracing the lute's strings before remarking, "I see the Lord's house finally appreciates good music." The quip didn't aid her case, but it lightened the room's tension, drawing suppressed smirks from the guards and murmurs from the crowd. Witnesses were summoned next, a parade of emotional testimonies designed to seal her fate. Some sisters wept openly, their sobs punctuating tales of corrupted innocence. Others testified to Lucia's encouragement of levity, unfit for holy women. A nervous novice, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind, swore that Lucia had taught her to laugh during Lent, a season of solemn fasting where joy was anathema. Lucia's faint smile in response only deepened the drama, her composure a silent rebuke to the hysteria. The inquisitor, his patience fraying like old rope, thundered that she had mocked the sacred order, his finger jabbing accusatorily. Lucia bowed slightly, her voice steady and laced with irony. Mockery implies effort, Father. I was merely honest. Even the stern guard at her side cracked a smirk, the emotional undercurrent of her defiance resonating with those weary of unyielding authority. This exchange highlighted the flaws in medieval justice systems, where emotional appeals often swayed outcomes more than evidence, and defiance could elevate the accused to folk hero status. Chroniclers of the era note similar trials, like those during the Albigensian Crusade, where witty retorts from the condemned exposed the hypocrisy of their judges, turning legal proceedings into platforms for resistance. As the day wore on, Lucia's responses wove a tapestry of emotional hooks, defiance laced with humor, piety twisted into provocation, that captivated the hall. She crossed herself with exaggerated politeness after each barb, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the stage. The verdict, of course, was as predetermined as the tides, guilty of scandalous conduct and the corruption of her holy vocation. Her punishment was pronounced with solemn finality, public penance to humble her spirit, followed by lifetime confinement in a stricter convent, a fortress of isolation designed to crush the very individuality she embodied. Lucia accepted it with grace, crossing herself once more and murmuring, "At least you didn't excommunicate me. I rather enjoy company." In that moment, the problem with Lucia crystallized. No matter the efforts to shame her, she commandeered the spotlight, her unbowed spirit an emotional anchor for those witnessing the trial. The proceedings concluded with the clergy retreating, their dignity dented like battered armor, while the audience dispersed in whispers of awe. Sister Lucia, history's most notorious nun, departed the hall smiling, her trial not a defeat but a triumph of will. In the annals of medieval justice, where authority sought to suppress defiance, she had flipped the script, leaving an indelible mark on all who beheld her unyielding grace. The emotional resonance of her stand, against a system that equated control with divinity, lingered like incense, a testament to the power of one woman's refusal to kneel. When the Church pronounced judgment on Sister Lucia of Monferrato, it aimed not merely to chastise the body, but to pulverize the personality, a declaration of war against the very essence that made her irrepressible. Her sentencing was to be executed with the full theater of humility and public contrition, humiliation cloaked in ritual, starvation as spiritual medicine, and exile to a place where her legend could be buried under layers of enforced oblivion. The punishment commenced with the procession of penance, a spectacle designed to strip away dignity before the eyes of the world. Lucia was divested of her finer habit, clad instead in a rough wool sack that chafed like sandpaper against skin, and paraded barefoot through the bustling streets of the nearby town. In her hands she clutched a dripping candle, its wax melting faster than her resolve, symbolizing the fleeting nature of earthly vanities in medieval punitive rites. The crowd assembled like vultures to a feast, peasants gawking with wide-eyed curiosity, merchants murmuring behind folded arms, and one bold woman reportedly shouting from the throng, "At least she made the church interesting again." A testament to how Lucia's notoriety had already seeped into public consciousness, turning her into a folk symbol of spirited resistance. Priests chanted somber psalms as the procession wound its way, their voices a monotonous drone, meant to underscore her fall from grace. Yet Lucia, ever the performer, muttered her own wry commentary under her breath. "Blessed are the meek," they intoned. "Temporarily," she whispered back. A nearby onlooker coughed to mask a chuckle, the emotional ripple of her defiance spreading even in chains. This public shaming echoed historical practices in medieval Europe, where penance processions served as both deterrent and entertainment, reinforcing communal bonds through shared spectacle, while humiliating the offender. Though, in Lucia's case, it only amplified her aura. At the cathedral steps, the climax unfolded. She was compelled to kneel and beg forgiveness for corrupting her sisters, her voice projected for all to hear. Kneeling on the cold stone that bit into her knees, Lucia complied. But instead of the expected tears and groveling, she lifted her gaze and declared, "If joy is sin, then forgive me for spreading it." The bishop, by now regretting every syllable of her name that had crossed his desk, merely gestured for the guards to hasten her away, his face a mask of frustrated authority. Her words, laced with unrepentant sincerity, hooked the crowd's emotions, blending surprise with a grudging admiration for her unbowed spirit. From there, her path led to a convent fortress on the outskirts of Siena, a bastion colder and stricter than St. Margaret's, engineered specifically to contain women whose thoughts wandered too freely from the prescribed paths of piety. Here she was to dwell in perpetual silence, fasting twice weekly, speaking only in confession to recount her sins, an exquisite irony for the most loquacious woman in Christendom. Upon arrival, Lucia surveyed the grim gray walls that loomed like judgmental sentinels and quipped softly, "At least the architecture suits the mood." The new abbess, a figure of frosty command, welcomed her with the promise of redemption through rigor. Lucia's faint smile returned. "Redemption, I've heard, is overrated." That earned her an immediate 3 days without supper, a penalty meant to starve out rebellion but which only fueled her ingenuity. Her cell was a cramped void, sparse furnishings, tasteless gruel for meals, and company limited to faded saints painted on the walls, their expressions as weary as her own. Yet in this isolation, Lucia refused to fracture. If the church demanded remorse, she supplied sarcasm. Silence, she offered subtle insurgency. Scratching tiny notes into her cell's walls became her quiet revolt. Observations dry and defiant, like, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." The abbess less so, or silence may be holy. But it's terribly dull company. These etchings, discovered in later monastic inspections, highlight the psychological resilience of those confined, drawing parallels to historical figures like Joan of Arc, whose imprisonment writings revealed an unbroken will. Even in this fortress of despair, Lucia's influence persisted like a stubborn ember. She discovered that melted candle wax, when fermented with garden scraps, could yield a weak approximation of wine, not palatable, but enough to remind her of humanity. Caught once, she claimed it was chemical prayer, a defense that blended alchemy with devotion, leaving guards bemused. Despite the endless solitude, she amassed a covert following among the younger sisters, who stole glances at her during prayers, drawn to the quiet rebellion gleaming in her eyes. She spoke not a word to them, rules forbade it, but her presence alone whispered, "You can think and still endure." The abbess, enraged by this intangible sway, ordered further confinement. No visitors, no writing tools, no candles after dusk. Lucia's response was serene, perfect. "I've been meaning to work on my inner life." Days blurred into months, months into years, the calendar a monotonous march. While the abbess believed she'd interred a sinner, she'd unwittingly preserved a legend. Lucia's laughter, now muted to a stubborn inner hum, echoed through every chill corridor, a testament to the enduring power of spirit over stone. By the time Sister Lucia of Monferrato entered her final years, she had achieved the near impossible. She had rendered repentance not just bearable, but entertaining, a feat that would have amused the saints themselves. The years in the Sienese convent had etched their mark upon her, thinning her once vibrant frame and paling her skin to the hue of aged parchment. Yet her wit endured starvation far better than most holy figures weathered martyrdom. The abbess's every edict became another canvas for her subtle artistry, each rule a game to bend without breaking, each sermon a prompt for a private jest carved from the marrow of her unyielding spirit. Forbidden to speak, she mastered the language of raised eyebrows and sidelong glances, conveying volumes in the arch of a brow. Denied candles, she turned to moonlight prayers, her whispers to the silver beams a defiant communion with the stars. When commanded to meditate on death, she murmured to no one in particular. "At least it's something new," a line that, had it been overheard, might have earned her another week of bread and water. The other nuns regarded her with a potent brew of fear and reverence, their emotions a tangled knot, mirroring the broader historical reverence for rebellious spirits who refused to dim. Lucia had transmuted silence into a form of quiet insurgency, a protest so understated it made blind obedience seem the true folly. Even her punishments lost their bite over time. Ordered to fast for insolence, she would nod with solemn gravity and quip to the empty air, "Finally, a diet I didn't invent. The toll of confinement was undeniable. Her body weakened, joints aching from endless kneeling, energy ebbing like a tide retreating from the shore. But her essence remained infuriatingly intact, a spark that no deluge of discipline could quench. This resilience echoed the unbowed tenacity of other historical rebels against ecclesiastical cages, like Marjorie Kempe, the 15th century English mystic whose tearful visions and outspoken piety drew accusations of heresy, yet whose emotional outpourings carved a space for female voices in a male-dominated faith. Or consider the Beguines, those semi-monastic women of medieval Low Countries who lived in communal piety without full vows, their independent spirituality a thorn in the Church's side, much like Lucia's refusal to let austerity eclipse humanity. As the seasons cycled into a monotonous blur, rumors began to weave themselves around her like vines overtaking ancient stone. Some whispered she had descended into madness, her solitude unraveling the mind. Others swore she communed with angels who departed her cell in fits of laughter, their celestial mirth a balm to her isolation. A visiting priest, summoned near the end to administer last rites, described her in hushed tones to his superiors as a woman of alarming clarity, too aware for her own salvation. Words that captured the emotional paradox of her existence, a soul too vivid for the shadows imposed upon it. Death, when it finally claimed her, arrived without fanfare, as unceremonious as a door softly closing on a raucous feast. There were no wails of anguish, no 11th-hour flood of repentance, no recited psalms to punctuate the fade. She simply reclined upon her narrow pallet, whispered something to the shadowed ceiling, doubtless laced with sarcasm, and let her eyes drift shut, as if stepping into a well-earned nap. The sisters interred her beyond the convent walls, in accordance with custom for the disgraced. Her grave an unmarked scar upon the earth, denied even the dignity of a headstone. Yet legend, that most persistent of historians, claimed the soil above her refused to settle. Each dawn it shifted subtly, as if the ground itself conspired to exhume her, unwilling to let her rest in obscurity. This tale, amplified in oral traditions and later monastic folklore, symbolized how death had not silenced Lucia, but magnified her, transforming a troublesome nun into an emblem of untamed freedom. In an era when the Church equated conformity with salvation, her posthumous stirrings evoked the enduring symbolism of figures like the 12th century Trotula of Salerno, whose medical writings on women's health defied clerical suppression, surviving through clandestine copies that whispered of forbidden knowledge. Or Joan of Arc, whose voices from God led to execution, only for her trial's injustices to fuel a cult of martyrdom that canonized her centuries later. For Lucia, the grave's unrest became a metaphor for the soul's refusal to kneel, a quiet revolution that outlasted stone and scripture. Pilgrims soon trickled to that humble plot, not beseeching miracles of healing or fortune, but courage, the audacity to question, to laugh, to live beyond the vows that bound them. They left modest offerings, a splash of wine seeping into the dirt, a quill etched with a defiant verse, ribbons tied to nearby thorns as nods to her once jazzed statues. The Church, predictably, moved to quash this grassroots veneration, dispatching edicts to deter the faithful. But once the public anoints a figure as saint or scamp, no bull from Rome can fully unmake the myth. In death, as in life, Lucia's symbolism swelled. A beacon for the misfits, the overthinkers, the unapologetic sinners who dared not to sorrow for their humanity. Her story, born of confinement, bloomed into a reminder that true heresy lies not in joy, but in the fear of it, a legacy that death, far from extinguishing, had etched eternally into the human heart. Lucia of Monferrato was finally dead, her restless spirit at last committed to the earth. But the trouble was she refused to stay silent about it, her essence lingering like an unextinguished echo in the corridors of history. For the Church, her passing should have marked a neat closure to an unseemly episode. One fewer heretic to contend with, one less thorn in the side of divine order. Yet, as fate would have it, death did nothing to quell the whispers or stifle the laughter that had defined her. The burial was orchestrated with deliberate austerity. No soaring hymns to lift her soul, no flickering candles to light her way, and certainly no eulogies to soften her memory. The abbess, who had devoted years to snuffing out Lucia's indomitable flame, decreed her body be laid in an unmarked grave beyond the convent's sanctified walls. "Let her rest in silence," she intoned, her words a final attempt to impose the quietude that had eluded them in life. But even the soil seemed to rebel, shifting subtly within days, not with dramatic upheavals, but just enough to draw notice, as if the ground itself conspired against containment. Some attributed it to the whims of wind or the settling of earth. Others whispered of a deeper restlessness, a soul too vibrant to lie still. Among the younger nuns, tales circulated in hushed tones that Lucia was still angling for the last word, her grave a stage for posthumous mischief. Then the stories proliferated, weaving a tapestry of the supernatural that blurred the line between folklore and faith. A novice vowed she'd heard faint humming near the grave under the cover of night, a melody both haunting and familiar. Another claimed to have glimpsed candlelight dancing in Lucia's former cell, where no flame had been kindled. The abbess dismissed these as flights of fancy, the delusions of impressionable minds, until a visiting priest, one who'd witnessed her trial's theatrics, confessed to sensing an inexplicable warmth, as if laughter itself hung in the air like residual incense. This immediate myth-making reflected a broader cultural phenomenon in medieval Europe, where the deaths of controversial figures often birthed legends, much like the posthumous cults around mystics such as Catherine of Siena, whose unorthodox piety inspired devotion despite ecclesiastical wariness. Soon, word seeped into the surrounding villages, transforming a disgraced nun's grave into an unlikely pilgrimage site. Locals, then travelers from afar, began converging, not seeking absolution for sins but courage to face their own constraints. They left humble offerings, splashes of wine evoking her cellar raids, quills symbolizing her sharp words, ribbons reminiscent of her adorned statues, tokens honoring a woman who'd alchemized rebellion into a semblance of holiness. The church predictably mobilized to suppress this burgeoning cult, issuing edicts and patrols to deter the faithful. But once the populace anoints someone as saint or icon, no papal bull can fully erase it. History abounds with examples, from the suppressed veneration of Joan of Arc to the underground reverence for Waldensian preachers, where popular piety outpaced institutional control. Ironically, the very clergy who'd once thundered condemnations began subtly revising their narratives in private correspondences. One bishop penned that she was perhaps misguided, but not malicious. Medieval shorthand for conceding narrative defeat, a quiet acknowledgement that the story had slipped from their grasp. Lucia's legend burgeoned not through sanctioned sermons, but in the intimacy of whispers, evolving into a symbol for the misfits, women who chafed against their roles, thinkers whose questions pierced the veil of dogma, sinners who embraced their humanity without apology. In death as in life, she remained uncontainable, unforgettable, and somehow still claiming the final chuckle. You'd think mortality might have polished her reputation, but in authentic medieval style, it only amplified the eccentricity. The church launched a concerted erasure, her name excised from convent ledgers, trial documents discreetly misplaced or consigned to flames. Her scant possessions, a quill etched with irreverent doodles, a scrap of parchment bearing poetic fragments, and a dubious bottle of herbal elixir, reduced to ash. The sanctioned tale cast her as a wayward soul reclaimed by enforced silence, the sort of platitude uttered when authority has lost the debate to a corpse. Yet narratives are tenacious, especially those laced with human relatability. Within a generation, Lucia transcended memory into myth, transmitted by monks feigning disdain for gossip, and villagers who relished it unabashedly. Her story fractured into dual strands, both vexing to ecclesiastical powers. In the Orthodox version, she served as a cautionary archetype, a nun who flouted her vows and reaped divine retribution. Priests wielded her in homilies as a deterrent. The eras don't follow her path, portraying her as the exemplar of how mirth courts damnation and female curiosity invites ruin. It was a neat moralistic package, aligning with the church's efforts to reinforce gender norms and suppress dissent. akin to the sermonized warnings against figures like the Beguines, independent women whose communal piety skirted clerical oversight. The alternative lore, murmured in taverns and among restless novices, recast her as a folk champion, a sacred trickster who outfoxed bishops and departed with her humor unscathed. Some tales even ascribed miracles, wildflowers blooming anomalously in winter near her grave, wine blessed in her name resisting sourness. The church branded these false wonders, but pilgrims persisted, their devotion a grassroots rebellion mirroring the unsanctioned cults of medieval Europe, where social undercurrents elevated the marginalized to near sainthood. Chroniclers grappled with her enigma. One dubbed her a serpent among lilies, another simply problematic. Centuries on, an Italian poet christened her Saint Lucia the Laughing, earning a brief excommunication before his work's popularity prompted a discreet reversal. A.D. pattern seen in the fluctuating fortunes of Dante's critiques of church. Corruption, that was the crux. Lucia's tale defied domestication. Each effort to enter her deeper only amplified its resonance. The church reaping what it most dreaded, not another dissident, but an enduring dialogue. A narrative that persisted for its raw humanity, refusing to fade. Lucia ceased to be mere sinner or saint. She evolved into something perennial, a poignant reminder that sanctity devoid of humor swiftly devolves into hypocrisy. In the cultural mosaic of medieval society, where social hierarchies clashed with individual agency, her legacy sparked curiosity about the boundaries of faith, inspiring surprise at how one woman's defiance could ripple through time, challenging the very foundations of prescribed piety. Victorian Britain stood as the pinnacle of human advancement, a gleaming empire where steam engines roared across verdant countrysides like mechanical dragons. Gas lamps cast ethereal glows upon fog-shrouded city streets, and the burgeoning middle classes reveled in their ascent, toasting to progress with crystal goblets. Every parlor and dining hall transformed into a stage of modernity, where gleaming silverware danced under chandelier light, and dishes burst with colors so vibrant they seemed brushed by the hand of innovation itself, jellies quivering in unnatural hues, peas a defiant emerald green, pickles that shimmered like captured jewels, custards as golden as the sun at its zenith, and candies that could illuminate a child's nursery with their kaleidoscopic brilliance. Housewives, symbols of domestic triumph, served these feasts with pride, believing each vivid plate a testament to the empire's ingenuity. Yet beneath this veneer of refinement lurked an insidious shadow, a quiet epidemic of poisoning that turned the era's greatest boast, progress, into its deadliest curse. The Industrial Revolution, that seismic force reshaping Britain from the late 18th century onward, didn't merely feed a nation, it intoxicated it with false promises. Urbanization exploded. London's population surged from under 1 million in 1800 to over 6.5 million by 1900. Manchester's mills choked the skies with soot, and factories devoured rural workers, swelling cities into teeming hives where demand for food outstripped nature's pace. Merchants cornered by this voracious appetite turned to chemistry's cauldrons, birthplace of synthetic dyes and preservatives born from breakthroughs like William Perkins' 1856 Movine, the first aniline dye, or the widespread adoption of arsenic-based greens from Scheele's 1775 discovery of Scheele's green. Why await seasons for flavor when a vial could conjure it? A dash of copper sulfate revived pallid pickles into emerald splendor. Arsenic-laced pigments rendered confections irresistibly vivid. Lead acetate sweetened sour wines into nectar. Food laws? Virtually non-existent until the mid-19th century, leaving the market a wild frontier where trust in progress supplanted scrutiny. Newspapers extolled chemical marvels. Physicians debated their merits, and only the occasional corpse, racked by cramps, blindness, or convulsions, hinted at the truth. The irony cut deep, evoking an emotional vertigo. A society obsessed with purity, moral rectitude, social hierarchy, spiritual upliftment, methodically poisoning itself in pursuit of perfection. Every banquet a lavish chemical trial, every bright dessert a triumph of technology masking mortality. Beneath lace doilies and etiquette manuals, the Victorian palate had grown lethal, its aftertaste not of empire's glory, but of arsenic-laced regret. This betrayal of trust, rooted in the era's blind faith in science as salvation, surprised even contemporaries when reformers like Frederick Ackham exposed in 1820 that everyday groceries harbored toxins akin to rat poison. As cities ballooned and innovation raced unchecked, the age of enlightenment devoured its own children, turning the dinner table from hearth of family into arena of unwitting self-destruction, a poignant reminder that progress, unchecked, extracts a human toll far steeper than any ledger could account. Few sights in Victorian England captured the imagination, quite like the confectioner's window. A kaleidoscope of temptation, where rows of glass jars shimmered with rainbow-hued delights, peppermint drops that promised a cool burst of freshness, lemon lozenges tangy enough to pucker the lips, and hard candies that whispered joy to any child clutching a halfpenny. The air inside these shops carried the sweet symphony of sugar and innocence, a haven where families indulged in small luxuries amid the grind of industrial life. Yet concealed behind this sugary facade lurked a monstrous peril, a silent assassin that turned treats into tragedies. Arsenic, the era's insidious killer, wove itself into the very fabric of these confections, transforming delight into death. Color was the currency of success in the competitive world of sweets. In a society obsessed with appearances, where social status was signaled by the vibrancy of one's table or the polish of one's attire, drab gray candies simply wouldn't entice buyers. Confectioners vied to produce the most eye-catching hues, greens as lush as summer meadows, reds fiery as sunset, yellows bright as daffodils. True magic, however, came at a cost. Natural dyes like saffron from crocus stamens or cochineal from crushed insects were prohibitively expensive for the mass market catering to working-class pockets. Instead, industry supplied affordable wonders, synthetic pigments brewed in factories that doubled as producers of wallpaper, textiles, and pesticides. Among the most favored was Sheely's Green, a brilliant emerald derived from copper arsenite, which made candies gleam like precious stones. It also proved lethally toxic, seeping into young bodies with every lick. The most notorious catastrophe unfolded in Bradford in 1858, a grim tableau that exposed the dangers lurking in everyday indulgences. A local sweetmaker, aiming to economize, substituted adulterated plaster of Paris for sugar in his peppermint lozenges. Unbeknownst to him, the plaster was laced with pure arsenic trioxide, a byproduct of careless industrial processes. Within days, the toll was devastating. Over 20 souls perished, predominantly children whose innocent cravings led to agonizing ends. Writhing in pain, vomiting relentlessly, their small frames convulsing before stillness claimed them. Scores more suffered, their symptoms a horrifying litany of cramps, blindness, and neurological torment. Newspapers sensationalized it as the Bradford poisoning, headlines screaming of the betrayal. Yet no laws were breached. The sweets had been peddled legally by a trusted vendor to unsuspecting patrons who equated brightness with benignity. This wasn't an anomaly, but a symptom of a widespread malaise. Across Britain, reports trickled in of mysterious ailments tied to colorful confections, persistent stomach pains that doubled families over, unexplained vomiting that weakened the strong, and deaths shrouded in confusion. Victorian child mortality rates, already alarmingly high at around 150 per 1,000 live births in the mid-century, were exacerbated by such hidden hazards, with urban poor suffering most acutely. Candy makers, when confronted, pleaded ignorance or victimhood, asserting they unaware of arsenic's potency in minute doses, a convenient amnesia amid profit-driven practices. Historical records reveal that arsenic was ubiquitous, used not just in sweets but in wallpapers and fabrics, contributing to phossy jaw in matchworkers and chronic illnesses in households, underscoring the era's cavalier embrace of chemicals. The true horror extended beyond the poison itself to the societal complacency that allowed it. Parents purchased these treats with pride, symbols of affection in a harsh world. Shopkeepers dispensed them with warm smiles, building community trust. Chemists tallied profits in quiet ledgers. It would require decades of mounting outrage, fueled by investigative journalism in publications like The Lancet, before tentative regulations emerged in the 1860s. By then, countless Victorians, especially the vulnerable young, had ingested the bitter lesson. The more luminous the candy, the darker the secret it harbored, a poignant surprise that peeled back the era's facade of progress to reveal the human cost beneath. While arsenic-laced candies poisoned the dreams of Victorian children, another silent killer flowed freely at the tables of the refined. Lead, the insidious alchemist of sophistication, tainting the very wine that symbolized elegance. In the 19th century, wine was more than a beverage. It was a social sacrament, poured at grand dinners where toasts sealed alliances and crystal goblets gleamed under gaslight. Yet beneath this polished veneer lurked a toxic betrayal. As lead acetate, deceptively called sugar of lead for its sweetening properties, transformed sour, cheap vintages into velvety elixirs fit for the gentry. This practice, common among vintners seeking to cater to the burgeoning middle class, turned every sip into a gamble with death, a grim irony in an era obsessed with refinement. Lead's allure lay in its ability to mask flaws. Inexpensive wines, often produced from subpar grapes or stored in shoddy casks, carried a bite that offended delicate palates. A pinch of lead acetate softened the taste, lending a smooth, luxurious finish that belied the wine's humble origins. This wasn't mere culinary trickery. It was a cultural necessity in a society where appearances were everything. Victorian beauty standards extended beyond corseted waists and porcelain skin to the very aesthetics of consumption. Dining was performance, and no hostess could afford to serve anything less than perfection. Lead, cheap and effective, became a darling of the wine trade, its use so widespread that by the 1850s, medical journals like The Lancet estimated that up to a third of commercial wines in Britain contained detectable levels of the metal, with some samples exceeding safe limits by tenfold. The consequences were as subtle as they were devastating. Unlike arsenic's swift violence, lead poisoning crept in quietly, accumulating over months or years. Symptoms were insidious. Abdominal cramps dismissed as indigestion, fatigue blamed on overwork, and memory lapses chalked up to the stresses of modern life. In severe cases, drinkers suffered gout-like joint pain, tremors, or the telltale lead line along the gums, a bluish-gray stain that marked the body's quiet rebellion. Medical texts from the era, such as those by physician Alfred Swain Taylor, documented cases where chronic lead exposure led to paralysis, blindness, or death, particularly among the affluent who could afford frequent indulgences. The irony cut deep. The pursuit of beauty and status, so central to Victorian identity, was literally poisoning the elite, turning their prized sophistication into a slow suicide. This toxic romance with lead wasn't limited to wine. It permeated cosmetics, where lead-based powders promised flawless complexions, and even medicines where it was prescribed for ailments from dyspepsia to hysteria. The cultural obsession with refinement blinded society to the danger, much as it had with arsenic and candies. Trade journals defended lead's use, arguing it was a necessary evil in a competitive market, while consumers, lulled by the era's faith in progress, rarely questioned the safety of their claret. When reformers like Arthur Hill Hassall began exposing these practices in the 1850s, their warnings were met with skepticism. After all, if wine sparkled and tasted divine, how could it harm? Yet the data was damning. Postmortems revealed lead in the organs of the deceased, and public health reports linked rising neurological disorders to adulterated goods. The tragedy lay not just in the physical toll, but in the betrayal of trust. As the very symbols of Victorian progress, science, industry, elegance, turned against those who revered them, leaving a bitter aftertaste of curiosity and dread. The Victorian obsession with vibrant aesthetics extended beyond candies and wine, seeping into the very staples that sustained daily life. Pickles, those crisp emerald green delights that graced every respectable table, were no exception. To achieve their jewel-like hue, grocers and manufacturers turned to copper sulfate, a compound as dazzling as it was deadly. Known as blue vitriol, it transformed pallid cucumbers into radiant garnishes, ensuring they stood out in the crowded marketplace of the Industrial Revolution. A single jar could elevate a meal from mundane to magnificent, a testament to progress in an era where visual appeal trumped all else. Yet each bite carried a hidden cost, as copper accumulated in the body, causing nausea, liver damage, and in severe cases, death symptoms often misdiagnosed as cholera or simple indigestion, in a time when medical science lagged behind industrial zeal. Milk, the wholesome emblem of purity, was perhaps the most shocking victim of adulteration. In the swelling cities of Victorian Britain, where urban demand outstripped rural supply, milk was stretched to meet profit margins. Vendors diluted it with water, often from sewage-tainted pumps, then masked the thinness with chalk, flour, or even plaster to restore its creamy appearance. To prevent spoilage in the absence of refrigeration, some added borax or formaldehyde, turning a nourishing staple into a chemical cocktail. The consequences were dire, particularly for infants who relied on milk as a primary sustenance. Historical records estimate that in the 1850s, infant mortality in urban areas hovered around 200 per 1,000 births, with adulterated milk a significant contributor. Babies fed these concoctions suffered from diarrhea, malnutrition, and wasting diseases, their tiny bodies unable to withstand the assault. Parents, unaware of the tampering, mourned losses they attributed to fate rather than fraud. Arthur Hill Hassall, a physician and chemist, emerged as a relentless crusader against this culinary treachery. Through his microscope, he exposed the horrors lurking in everyday foods, publishing findings in The Lancet that shocked the public. His 1855 book, Food and Its Adulterations, detailed copper in pickles, chalk in milk, and worse, sewage bacteria thriving in diluted dairy. His work sparked outrage, not just for the physical harm but for the emotional betrayal. The foods meant to nourish families were instead poisoning them. Hassall's investigations revealed that up to 80% of milk samples in London were adulterated, a statistic that fueled public horror and curiosity about the true cost of their daily fare. The pickle jar, once a symbol of abundance, became a vessel of suspicion. The milk pitcher, a harbinger of dread. These scandals underscored a broader societal tension. The Victorian faith in industrial progress clashed with the grim reality of unregulated commerce. Grocers, driven by competition, saw adulteration as a necessary evil to keep prices low and appearances high. Consumers, dazzled by the era's promise of plenty, rarely questioned the unnatural sheen of their provisions. The emotional impact was profound. Families felt deceived, their trust in the market eroded by the very innovations they celebrated. As reformers like Hassall pushed for change, the public began to see the dark underbelly of their glittering age, where every vibrant bite carried a hidden risk, stirring a mix of fear and fascination that would drive the slow march toward reform. The Victorian table, a stage for social aspiration, was a minefield of deceit beyond pickles and milk. Bread, the humble staff of life, was routinely adulterated with alum to whiten flour, masking its poor quality while irritating stomachs and stunting growth in children. Meat, often sourced from diseased livestock, was slathered with borax or painted with red lead to mimic freshness, concealing rot that spread infections like typhoid. Tea, the cornerstone of British ritual, was no safer. Vendors mixed used leaves with graphite, copper, or even hedge clippings, repackaging them as premium blends. By the 1850s, studies in The Lancet estimated that over half of commercial tea samples were contaminated, contributing to digestive ailments that baffled physicians. These practices weren't mere corner-cutting. They were systemic, driven by a cutthroat market where profit trumped ethics. The broader scandals painted a grim picture of a society eating its way to ruin. Preservatives like boric acid and salicylic acid, used to extend shelf life in butter and jams, triggered chronic illnesses, while outbreaks of dysentery and cholera were linked to tainted goods. Public health reports from the era noted a surge in gastrointestinal diseases. With urban death rates climbing, Manchester alone reported 25,000 annual deaths from preventable causes in the 1860s, many tied to adulterated food. The working class, unable to afford untainted luxuries, bore the brunt, their diets a lottery of poison. Middle-class households, chasing the sheen of refinement, weren't spared either. Their vibrant jellies and polished roasts carried the same risks, cloaked in elegance. The emotional toll was as potent as the physical. Families, trusting in the era's promise of progress, felt betrayed by the very market they relied on. The grocer's smile, once a symbol of community, became suspect. The daily loaf, a potential harbinger of sickness. Arthur Hill Hassal's exposés, amplified by muckraking journalists, stirred public outrage and curiosity, forcing a reckoning with the hidden costs of industrial abundance. Pamphlets and lectures detailed the chemical tricks of trade, from red lead in sausages to chalk in flour, sparking a wave of distrust that rippled through markets and kitchens. The scandal wasn't just about food. It was about the erosion of faith in an age that worshipped innovation. Every tainted bite underscored the paradox of Victorian progress. A society that prided itself on science was being undone by its own creations, leaving a legacy of suspicion that lingered long after the last poisoned crumb was swept away. The Victorian food adulteration crisis, with its toxic candies, lead-laced wines, and chalk-ridden milk, didn't just sicken bodies. It wounded the soul of a nation that prided itself on progress. The revelations of widespread poisoning, spearheaded by reformers like Arthur Hill Hassall, ignited a firestorm of public outrage that could no longer be ignored. By the late 1850s, the clamor for reform grew deafening, fueled by sensational exposés in The Lancet and newspapers that detailed the horrors lurking in everyday fare. The public, once lulled by the sheen of industrial abundance, awoke to a grim reality. Their trust in the market had been betrayed, their tables turned into unwitting battlegrounds. This awakening wasn't just practical, it was moral. A reckoning with the cost of unchecked greed in an age that equated innovation with virtue. The first significant step came with the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, a tentative stab at regulation that empowered local authorities to test food samples and fine offenders. It was a modest start, hampered by lax enforcement and loopholes that allowed merchants to dodge penalties with ease. Still, it marked a shift, a crack in the facade of laissez-faire capitalism that had let poison flourish. The real turning point arrived with the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, a more robust law that mandated accurate labeling and stricter penalties for adulteration. Inspectors, armed with microscopes and chemical tests, began raiding markets, uncovering alum in bread, copper in pickles, and arsenic in sweets. Convictions rose, over 20,000 annually by the 1880s. According to government reports, though fines were often trivial, a mere slap on the wrist for profiteers. These laws weren't just legal milestones. They reshaped public perception. The narrative of progress, once unassailable, now carried a cautionary edge. Reformers like Hassall became folk heroes, their work amplified by a press that thrived on moral crusades. Pamphlets and public lectures painted adulteration as a sin against the social contract, a betrayal of the family hearth. The emotional resonance was profound. Mothers wept over children lost to tainted milk, while fathers railed against grocers who'd once been neighbors. The middle class, so invested in the trappings of refinement, felt duped by their own aspirations. This shift echoed broader Victorian anxieties about morality and modernity. Science had promised salvation, but delivered poison, forcing society to grapple with the limits of its own ambition. The legacy of these scandals stretched far beyond the 19th century. They birthed the modern food safety movement, laying the groundwork for today's regulations and consumer protections. Yet the lessons were deeper, etched in the collective psyche. Progress, unchecked, could devour its own. The Victorian table, once a symbol of triumph, became a cautionary tale reminding future generations that innovation without scrutiny invites disaster. The era's glittering promise, tarnished by its own excesses, left a lasting imprint, a call to question the cost of convenience, delivered with the bitter aftertaste of a society that learned trust must be earned, not assumed. As the Victorian era's toxic banquet faded into the crucible of reform, another stage of rebellion was brewing across the Atlantic, where the seeds of a nation's defiance took root not in grand halls, but in the smoky, raucous confines of colonial American taverns. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these rough-hewn establishments were more than watering holes. They were the pulsing heart of revolution, where ideas fermented as freely as the ale. Picture a weathered wooden building, its windows glowing with candlelight, filled with the clamor of clinking tankards, heated debates, and the occasional burst of laughter or fisticuffs. Taverns like Boston's Green Dragon or Philadelphia's City Tavern weren't just places to drink. They were crucibles of equality, conspiracy and courage where merchants, farmers, and radicals mingled as equals, bound by a shared thirst for liberty and a good pint. In an era when social hierarchies were rigid, taverns leveled the playing field. A blacksmith could share a bench with a lawyer, their voices equally loud in the din of debate. Here, the seeds of the American Revolution were sown, watered by rum and resentment against British taxes. The Green Dragon, dubbed the headquarters of the Revolution by Daniel Webster, hosted the Sons of Liberty, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock plotted over mugs of cider. These gatherings weren't mere drunken rants. They were strategic, with tavern keepers often complicit, turning a blind eye to seditious talk. Historical records show that by the 1770s, over 90% of Boston's adult male population frequented taverns, making them de facto town halls where grievances against the crown, stamp taxes, tea duties became rallying cries. Taverns also served as nerve centers for communication in a fragmented colony. With no formal postal system until 1775, they doubled as mail hubs, newsrooms, and recruitment posts for militias. Broadsides denouncing British rule were pinned to tavern walls, read aloud to illiterate patrons by firelight. The emotional pull was undeniable. A farmer, weary from toil, might hear of the Boston Massacre over a dram of whiskey, his anger stoked by the camaraderie of shared outrage. This democratic spirit wasn't without its contradictions. Slaves and women were often excluded from the inner circles, yet taverns still offered a rare space where class distinctions blurred, fostering a sense of collective identity that fueled rebellion. The cultural significance of these spaces ran deep. In a society shaped by Puritan ideals, where excess was frowned upon, taverns stood as defiant outposts of human connection. They were where the disenfranchised found a voice, where whispers of independence grew into roars. By 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, taverns had already done much of the groundwork, knitting together a disparate people into a nation ready to fight. The surprise wasn't just their role in revolution, but their ability to transform ordinary men into architects of history, one drink and one idea at a time. In the rugged tapestry of colonial America, taverns were more than mere gathering spots. They were lifelines, stitching together communities in a wilderness where survival demanded camaraderie. From the 17th century onward, these alehouses sprouted like mushrooms after a storm, from the muddy streets of Boston to the frontier outposts of Virginia. They were rough-hewn sanctuaries where travelers found shelter, locals swapped stories, and the seeds of rebellion took root. Picture a low-ceilinged room, thick with the scent of spilled ale and wood smoke, where a fire crackled against the New England chill. A weathered sign, perhaps a painted dragon or a sheaf of wheat, swung outside beckoning all who sought warmth, news, or a fleeting escape from the grind of colonial life. Taverns were survival hubs in a land where isolation could kill as surely as disease or raids. They offered food, lodging, and stabling for horses, often doubling as post offices, courthouses, or even churches when a preacher passed through. In 1690s Massachusetts, with a population of barely 50,000, historical records note over 200 licensed taverns, one for every 250 souls, a testament to their centrality. They were democratic in a way the era's rigid hierarchies rarely allowed. A yeoman farmer could clink mugs with a merchant, their shared grievances against British taxes forging bonds stronger than class. Yet this egalitarianism had limits. Enslaved people were often barred, and Native Americans were served only at the tavern keeper's whim. Reflecting the era's deep racial divides, women too played a pivotal role, defying the puritanical constraints that sought to confine them. Tavern mistresses, like Boston's Hannah Clark or Philadelphia's Elizabeth Murray, ran establishments with sharp business acumen, balancing ledgers and tempers with equal skill. These women were anomalies in a society that preached female subservience, Yet their taverns thrived as hubs of gossip and intrigue. Clark's Tavern, for instance, was a known meeting spot for early patriots, her discretion as valuable as her ale. Historical accounts suggest women managed up to 20% of colonial taverns by the 1750s, their influence a quiet rebellion against gender norms, much like the subversive piety of medieval nuns like Lucia of Monferrato. The democratic spirit of taverns extended beyond their walls, fostering a nascent sense of American identity. Here men debated the Stamp Act or read aloud smuggled copies of Thomas Paine's pamphlets, their voices rising with every round. The emotional charge was palpable. A laborer, hardened by toil, might find his anger at British overreach validated by a neighbor's nod, their shared defiance crystallizing into resolve. Yet this freedom came with contradictions. Puritan sermons decried taverns as dens of vice, even as ministers frequented them for news. Taverns were where the colony's paradoxes played out. Liberty preached in rooms that excluded many, revolution plotted over drinks that dulled the senses. Their legacy was a messy, vital democracy, born not in solemn assemblies but in the raucous human hum of shared space, where every toast carried the weight of a nation in the making. In the smoky haze of colonial American taverns, the drinks themselves were more than mere refreshment. They were liquid catalysts of rebellion, each sip steeped in the economic and political tensions of the era. Rum, cider, Madeira, and whiskey flowed freely, their flavors as varied as the colonies themselves, but their significance ran deeper than taste. These beverages were tied to the transatlantic trade networks that fueled both prosperity and resentment, binding tavern patrons to the global empire while stoking their defiance against it. Picture a weathered bar counter, scarred from years of tankards slammed in heated debate, where a farmer might raise a glass of rum to toast liberty, unaware that its very production was entangled in the chains of the slave trade. Rum was the lifeblood of the colonies, distilled from molasses imported through the infamous trade triangle. New England shipped timber and fish to the Caribbean, receiving molasses in return, which was then transformed into the fiery spirit that warmed tavern nights. By the 1760s, Massachusetts alone boasted over 60 distilleries, producing millions of gallons annually, according to colonial trade records. Cheap and potent, rum was the drink of the masses, fueling both camaraderie and sedition. When Britain imposed the Sugar Act of 1764, taxing molasses to curb colonial profits, tavern-goers took it personally. Every overpriced dram became a reminder of imperial greed, turning casual drinkers into budding revolutionaries. Cider, pressed from the abundant apples of New England orchards, was the homespun alternative, a symbol of self-reliance. By 1770, the average colonist consumed over 30 gallons of cider yearly, its tangy bite a staple at every table from farmhouse to tavern. Its local roots made it a point of pride, especially as British taxes tightened their grip. Madeira, a fortified wine from Portuguese islands, was the choice of the elite, its rich sweetness signaling wealth and sophistication. Yet even this luxury wasn't immune to rebellion. Merchants smuggled it to evade duties, toasting defiance with every glass. Whiskey, emerging in the backcountry, carried a raw edge, distilled by Scots-Irish settlers, who bristled at British attempts to regulate their stills, foreshadowing later uprisings like the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. These drinks weren't just refreshments, they were emblems of resistance, each tied to the economic grievances that sparked revolution. The Molasses Act, Stamp Act, and Tea Act weren't abstract policies. They hit colonists in their tankards, making taverns hotbeds of dissent. A 1774 broadside from a Philadelphia tavern, preserved in historical archives, captures the mood. Tax our rum, tax our tea, but never our liberty. The emotional charge was electric. Every sip fueled anger at an empire that seemed to profit off colonial sweat while offering little in return. Taverns became stages where economic frustration met political fervor, with drinks serving as both solace and spark, binding patrons in a shared resolve that would soon ignite a nation. Colonial American taverns were not just places to drink. They were the beating heart of a revolution, where the hum of conversation shaped a nation's destiny. These rough-hewn halls served as newsrooms, where broadsides and smuggled pamphlets were read aloud, their words kindling defiance against British rule. A 1775 account from Boston's Green Dragon Tavern describes a room thick with pipe smoke, where Samuel Adams rallied patrons against the Tea Act, his voice rising over clinking mugs to declare, "No taxation without representation." Taverns were political stages, hosting secret meetings of groups like the Sons of Liberty, who plotted boycotts and protests under the guise of casual gatherings. By 1776, over 80% of colonial taverns doubled as informal political hubs, according to historical ledgers, making them critical to the spread of revolutionary fervor. Yet, the tavern's role wasn't all noble. The darker side of excess, drunken brawls, gambling debts, and ruined reputations, cast a shadow over their democratic promise. Puritan critics like Cotton Mather railed against taverns as nests of Satan, citing cases of men squandering wages or women facing ruin after too many nights in mixed company. These excesses fueled reform efforts, with some colonies passing laws by the 1760s to limit tavern hours or ban idle tippling. Still, the tavern's allure persisted, its chaos a mirror to the colony's own turbulent spirit. Women like Tavern Mistress Anne Clark navigated this tension, balancing profit with propriety while quietly enabling seditious talk, their role a subtle defiance of gender norms. The emotional pull of these spaces was undeniable. A farmer might enter weary from the plow, only to leave emboldened by tales of British tyranny, his resolve hardened by shared rum and shared rage. Taverns fostered a raw, messy democracy, where voices, however slurred, found equal weight. They were where Paine's common sense was debated, where the Declaration of Independence was first toasted, and where ordinary colonists became architects of rebellion. Their legacy endures in America's political DNA, from town hall meetings to modern bars, where debates still simmer over drinks. The surprise lies in their transformation of excess into empowerment, proving that revolution could be born not in solemn chambers but in the raucous, human clamor of a tavern's embrace, where every raised glass was a step toward freedom.